some of you were probably here for Pat's last talk, which was about women war correspondents in Vietnam. And today she's here to talk about the Middle East women war correspondents. I want to mention that in September, on I believe it's September 9th, she will be talking about Rosie the Riveter. So please, I hope you all tune into that. That is actually on September 16th. It's a Wednesday, but you'll have plenty of advance warning for that. For those of you who haven't met Pat yet, Pat is currently in Florida, where it is very hot, but she is a resident of Mattituck, and she's made an extensive study of women's roles in World War II and has participated in summer studies at Cambridge and Oxford universities. In 2013, she completed a master's thesis entitled Women Secret Agents in World War II, a topic she has already covered for us at the library. She has also spoken about women aviators, nurses at the home front in World War II, and we're happy to have her here talking about women war correspondents once again. Thank you very much, Pat, for being here.
Thank you, Penny. I'm delighted to be at the Rogers Memorial Library again, although it's virtually. But I always enjoy presenting to you folks and to your audience. I am in Florida and it is warm, but we'll get started now. I am going to talk about women journalists in the who are reporting from the Middle East. So here we're going to have, I'm going to introduce you to 4 journalists: Christiane Amanpour, Lara Logan, Lindsay Addario, and Marie Colvin. They're going to be the focus of this program, and I'll be using their stories to highlight significant issues that confront journalists, women journalists today, especially those in the Middle East. You know, some people assume that war journalists go into combat or combat zones because of bravado or of an addiction to adrenaline. But for these women, the covering of the war became a moral imperative. They push themselves into the eye of war so that they can be on the front lines of history, so that they can bear witness to events as they unfold, and so that they can report back to the public, so that the public has a better understanding of the world. Objectivity. Yes.
Share your screen. Your screen.
Oh, the screen isn't shown. Just a moment. Pat, I don't have it up here. The how I'm able to do that.
Okay. You had it up just before ready to go. So just click the share screen.
I don't have that showing on my screen. Do I need to close out my program?
Maybe just go on with the talk as is now. Maybe just go on with the talk.
Pardon me?
Maybe just go on with the talk right now. And
okay. All right, I'll just go on. Anyway, here we are.
Wait a minute. I'm just going to come in here for just a moment. I think her visuals are a little bit important in this talk, but Pat, can you see at the bottom of your screen, it says share screen, it's a green box?
No, I don't see that, Penny.
Could we go offline for a minute and have you work with Pat on this? Because I hate to proceed without being able to show all of the things that you've gotten together for this talk.
Okay, so you're not seeing the slides on it when I push play?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, I don't understand that, but okay, I will sign out then for the time
Well,
being.
well, wait a minute. Pat, can you give us some advice here? Pat Slawinski?
Yes, click on a share screen.
I
And
don't
then,
have a share screen.
okay,
I don't,
if you go on the bottom of the
no,
bottom, there's a green
I'll close
arrow.
out of, you need me to close out of the,
Or the other thing to do is to just click on the little Zoom icon that may bring it back up.
okay. Now I'm not even seeing the Zoom icon.
It should be on the bottom menu
Yeah, I'm
on the
looking.
computer.
I'm looking.
And
Is
that's,
she still listed as a host, Pat?
Pardon me?
Pat Slawinski, is Pat DelGiorno still listed as a host? Could
she's
that?
a panelist, yes.
Here, I've got this one now. Okay. All right. Share screen. Have you got it now?
Yep, all set, Pat.
Okay. So shall I start over or where I was?
Why don't you just go on from where you were?
Okay. Objectivity, moral imperative, and risks are important issues to journalists and to the work that they do, and ultimately to us, the public. We depend on journalists to portray events with truth and morality and fairness. But we also have to recognize the enormous risks that they take to do that. First up of our journalists is Christiane Amanpour. From the 1991 Gulf War to the siege of Sarajevo, from the invasion of Iraq to the trial of Saddam Hussein, her reporting has made her a force to be reckoned with. The Gulf War propelled her to the world stage, but it was the war in Bosnia that proved a defining moment in her life. For me, she said, the war in Bosnia and what I witnessed changed everything. I saw the very best and I saw the very worst of humanity. You see the pictures on your screen now, and the first one of women running away from snipers, and in the second picture, a man holding two terrified children amidst the horror. The worst, she said, was the Bosnian Serbs, armed and backed by their leader, Slobodan Milosevic. They were slaughtering civilians, women, little kids, old men. It was hard to believe, Christiane said, that only a decade earlier, Sarajevo, that was an ethnically mixed and sophisticated, very liberal city, had been the venue for the 1984 Winter Olympics. It was hard to imagine the stadium where British ice dancers Jane Torville and Christopher Dean skated into the history books, because now it was an overflowing graveyard. She said it was hard to summon the music, bolero, that brought them a gold medal, when all we could hear now was the pound of mortar fire and the whizzing of snipers' bullets. But war can also bring out the best in people. It brought out the best in those who resisted and those who clung to the belief that once this hell had ended, they could go back to living again in their beloved city. As a young reporter, Amanpour said, "Bosnia is where I found my voice." As a person who had been taught the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, tolerance, to see that all under mortal threat in Bosnia was formative. I resolved then to do what I could to fight it, through my words, through our pictures, and our huge and powerful platform. In a film clip that I'm going to show you next, Amanpour talks about objectivity and its place in war reporting. But first, I want to show you a picture of what was best in Sarajevo. The cellist of Sarajevo. At 4 p.m. on May 27th, 1992, a long line of people waited patiently for bread, standing in front of the last working bakery in Sarajevo, when a mortar shell dropped into the middle of them. It killed 22 people instantly. Vidan Smailovic, a cellist whom you see in the picture on the screen, looked out his window and he saw flesh, blood, bone, and rubble scattered everywhere. It was the moment that he knew he had had enough. He stood by his window in shock, but then he carried his cello down to the street and he played Albinoni's Adagio. He played it every day for 22 days, one day for each person killed in the mortar blast, even as bombs and rockets blasted about him. His story is a story of courage and grace in the most horrific of times. It inspired not only his fellow Sarajevans, but also citizens all over the world. In this next clip, Christiane is going to tell what Bosnia and objectivity meant to her.
Bosnia, you have said, is your proudest moment as a journalist. Can you talk about that experience in general? What happened in Bosnia to you as a reporter?
Coming off the Gulf War, which was an incredible adventure for journalists, and to go right into the darkness of what was happening in the Balkans was a really rude shock and a rude awakening. It was also something that I didn't fully appreciate and understand initially. I didn't realize how different it was. But as we reported, and again, I was there with many of my colleagues for the entire debacle, from when it started in 91 to when it ended with Dayton at the end of 95, and I stayed beyond during the peace phase of it. But what we found there was not an adventure. What we found there was a real challenge, both journalistically and morally. The challenge journalistically was to cover it, which we did, I think, very well, because again, we had a lot of access, because there were no big armies controlling us. Morally, we had to understand what we were faced with, that this wasn't, as the politicians, the US politicians, the European politicians were saying, this wasn't just an ugly, dirty little civil war. This was just an explosion of ancient ethnic hatreds that had gone on for hundreds of years, and oh my goodness, we can't do anything about it. It's designed to be like this, and it will continue until it's over. No, what we found there was a genocide. And we found genocide 50 years after genocide of the Holocaust. We found it in our backyard, on our watch, in Europe, and in front of the most sophisticated electronic media and broadcast ability that history had ever seen. And still nothing was being done about it. For 4 years, one side was able to slaughter another side for purely ethnic reasons, to ethnically cleanse and to kill and to create ethnically pure zones. This is the definition of genocide. And we called it. We called it, and it wasn't popular. I found my voice because I was criticized, and I was criticized by some people for quote unquote taking sides. And I was shocked and I was upset and I couldn't believe it. And when you're accused of violating the golden rule of journalism, which is objectivity, you really, if you're serious, you wonder what's going on. What have you done? How, are you wrong? And I had to really think about it, examine it, try to understand what I was meant to be doing and why I was there, and what does objectivity actually mean. And I believe that in situations of gross violation of human rights, of gross violations of humanity, of genocide, of crimes of war, there is a different standard that is applied. Objectivity, I believe, means giving each side their hearing, but not treating each side the same, not drawing a moral equivalence, which would be a false equivalence, not saying on the one hand, on the other hand, the person who's being sniped and killed is somehow equal to the person who's sniping and killing. The forces who are bombarding, besieging, and shelling a city full of civilians do not have the same moral standing as those who are being bombed, shelled, starved, and besieged. And that is a truth. That was the truth that we found and that we reported, and that to this day set the standard, certainly for myself and my generation, of how we report, how we tell the stories when we're faced with these severe situations. If you think that it is your duty to see the murdered and the murderer and say, and give them equal time and equal weight on the false impression that you are being objective, then you are an accomplice. And if you're neutral, and if you're an accomplice in this situation, you are an accomplice to genocide. And I wasn't going to do it.
Truthful, not neutral. For Christiane, truth-telling was all. After Bosnia, she went on to cover other hotspots around the world. With CNN, she produced a 2-hour documentary called Scream Bloody Murder. In that documentary, she examines how the world has fallen short of stopping genocide. After the Holocaust, since the world said never again, the film looks at atrocities in Bosnia, Cambodia, Iraq, Rwanda, and Darfur. At the 2019 Skoll World Forum, she talked about the role of journalists, about press freedom and truth-telling in an era of seismic shifts. Truthful, not neutral, she told the audience, explaining that moral courage far outweighs neutrality. Without truth we seek, there is no democracy, only dictatorship. Without the truth we bring, there is no rule of law, only anarchy and destruction. Without truth, there are only lies that lead us into a dangerous fog of confusion. This dystopian nightmare is especially acute today. Christiane urged her colleagues and her fellow reporters, first, to robustly recommit to fact-based reporting without fear or favor on the issues. Second, she told them, don't stand for being labeled crooked or lying or failing, but rather stand up together. For divided, we will all fall. Those were wise words when she spoke them, and there are wise words especially now. Now I'd like to introduce you to photojournalist Lindsay Addario in this next film clip.
Do not call Pulitzer Prize-winning war photographer Lindsay Addario an adrenaline junkie. She's not. Don't call her fearless. She's not that either. What she does is terrifying, and it does scare her. The searing scenes she shoots sometimes make her cry so much she cannot see behind her lens. But she goes back to the front lines, to famines, because, as she wrote in her memoir, it's what I do.
4 New York Times journalists were held captive.
Even after being kidnapped twice in Libya and Iraq, after being assaulted and traumatized, it's still what she does.
They are all home safe now.
But there's a question in this era, when the powerful tell lies and make people doubt, how much does the work of a witness matter? She happens to think it matters more now than ever. So she spent some time with us in the National Studio to talk of the costs of opening eyes. Welcome to the National.
Thank you.
We tried to decorate the place a little bit for you.
Wow, it's amazing.
As hard as it is to look at them, can you hear any of these? Like, are the sounds of any one of these really loud in your head?
I mean, Libya, for sure.
This one up here?
Yeah. And Korangal,
That's Afghanistan?
yeah, that's in Afghanistan, so that's 2007.
And what are you hearing when you look at that?
I mean, that's right after an ambush. So we were hit from 3 sides by the Taliban, and it was just cracking, you know. There was the wailing and moaning, and that's a funeral for Mama Cisse. She was a young woman who bled to death during pregnancy, during childbirth.
And a completely normal pregnancy.
Yeah.
Right?
She was pregnant with twins, delivered the first baby in the village, and the second baby wouldn't come out. She had to take a canoe across a river after having just delivered the first baby, and then like about 6 hours over bumpy roads in an ambulance to get to the hospital. That's when I met her. And I photographed the delivery of the second baby, and then she started bleeding, and no one, like the midwives were just sort of mopping up the blood and saying, oh, it's normal, it's okay. And
You knew.
I knew something was wrong. So I actually ran to try to find the doctor, the one doctor in the whole province. And he was in surgery, and I went into surgery. I put on scrubs. I went in. I said, I think this woman's dying. And he said, well, I'm busy. And I went back, and they picked her up and carried her to him, and she died. Yeah.
That scene didn't just rattle Addario. It touched nerves in important places. Time magazine put out an 8-page spread that caught the eye of the pharmaceutical company Merck, which then put aside $500 million to fight maternal death. That's making a difference with a photograph, but it doesn't always work that way. These are American soldiers.
Correct. So this is during the Battle of Fallujah. So this is in November of 2004. And there were so many wounded American Marines coming out of the Battle of Fallujah that they cleared out the inside of a cargo aircraft and literally flew them on the floor of the plane, and they were all seated on the walls. And this is how they were flown to Ramstein in Germany for treatment.
I don't know that Americans had really seen pictures like this.
They had,
at that
I
point.
don't think they had. I had never had access like this. And this was for Life magazine. So we got this incredible, unprecedented access. And Life held the photos through the re-election of Bush. And my photo editor said, my feeling is the editor-in-chief doesn't think the American public can handle seeing these images. And I was furious. And I said, you know, how dare you send me to Fallujah if you don't even have the guts to publish what I'm seeing. And so luckily I called the New York Times Magazine, and they published them.
But that's why you take a picture
Yeah,
like
of
that,
course,
right?
Of course. I mean, yeah.
The moments she captures don't leave Addario. Sometimes the faces of people at their lowest have ended up being the ones she sees in her mind when she's in trouble.
Photographer Lindsay Addario was one of them. The group was beaten and threatened with death.
That was certainly the case in March of 2011. Addario was with Anthony Shadid, Tyler Hicks, and Stephen Farrell when they were grabbed by Muammar Gaddafi's men, kidnapped, beaten, and moved around. Addario knew enough about the sexual violence women face to fear the worst.
I've heard the stories, I've heard the testimonies that I've heard of women in the Democratic Republic of Congo, women in Darfur. You know, I feel like I got off easy. I mean, these are women who were raped, they were gang raped. Their stories are horrific. And so for me in Libya, you know, over the time of our kidnap, I was touched, I was groped, I was, you know, tied up, blindfolded, beaten up. But for me, it was nothing compared to what the women that I documented went through. But I did sort of turn to them for a source of strength in the middle of the kidnapping in Libya. Like, I remember one night we were in prison and we were all terrified. We had no idea how long we would be held for and what they would do to us. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, if those women in Congo and Darfur can hold their head up and do this, I can get through this. And I just kept telling myself, like, I can do it. And that's sort of, they were really a source of strength for me.
And when you went home, you got pregnant.
I did. When I came home from Libya, I was still ambivalent because I think as a woman, a professional woman, especially a woman in this job where we travel all the time, you know, it's very hard to figure out what life will look like as a mother. And so I didn't really have any role models at that time. I didn't know any other photographers, war photographers who were mothers. And so I was terrified, I was terrified to sort of go down that path. And I remember just turning to my husband and saying, forget it. Like, we need to start life. Like, I've had enough of death and I can't do this right now. And I got pregnant like right away.
Life got better and work didn't stop, but the world changed a bit, and the urgency to bear witness at times feels even more acute.
Is it getting harder or easier to make an impact with images in this climate?
Harder, I think.
Why?
Because we're so bombarded with images, and we're so bombarded by social media, by violence, by blood. I don't think an image has to be graphic to be powerful. I think an image has to be subtle, but it has to tell a story. And I think, we see so many images every single day that most people, they don't pay attention anymore. I think people's attention span is just almost nothing.
And I wonder, does it drive you
Yes,
even more?
it drives me even more, because I think, we have a president in America who says journalists are the enemy of the people. He says fake news, everything is fake news. He lies basically every day of his presidency. And I think it's really important as a journalist to show the importance of journalism with integrity, the importance of being there, the importance of calling out leaders around the world who lie. And so, I covered Darfur for 6 straight years, and there was a case where I was in Chad and there had been a massacre of government soldiers. And President Bashir went on TV and he said, that didn't happen. No government soldiers were killed. And we went to the border and found a truckload of rebels and said, like, hey, did this happen? And they said, yes. And we said, well, can you take us? And they were like, well, it's super dangerous. They're Antonovs flying overhead and they can bomb, And we were like, look, we have to see it to report on it for the New York Times. And we went, and there were bodies clear across the desert. And that picture was on the front page of the New York Times. And when you have a picture as proof, you cannot lie. The fundamental fact that a photographer has to be there is really important at this time in history.
It is the curse of the world right now that there are a lot of troubled places she needs to go to next. South Sudan, maybe Yemen. It's our great fortune there's a Lindsay Addario ready to be there.
We heard Lindsay Addario tell about being captured and beaten along with 4 of her fellow journalists in Libya. In the Middle East, the danger for journalists is far greater than ever. In previous conflicts, if a journalist was killed, it was because it happened as part of the battle that he or she was covering, or it was entirely accidental. That's not the case anymore. Today, journalists are considered fair game. They are often targeted. They are captured or killed. And that goes for male and female journalists. We all know of the horror of Daniel Pearl and James Foley. We don't hear as much about all the other ethnic journalists who are killed and tortured. Next, we're going to hear about Lara Logan, who was nearly killed in Egypt while on assignment. Logan became a fixture of CBS News international coverage starting in 2002. She developed a reputation for her fearlessness, for reporting from war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, while she was embedded with US forces. In February of 2011, Logan was reporting in Cairo's Tahrir Square after President Hosni Mubarak's resignation, when she was assaulted by men in the crowd. On 60 Minutes, Lara told her interviewer, Scott Pelley, about her horrific experience. What had been a wild celebration, she had described it as sort of a cork of champagne being lifted off. But in a split second, it turned into a vicious attack on her. Hundreds of men surrounded her, tearing her clothes off, grasping chunks of her hair so viciously that she was nearly scalped. hands groping, grabbing at her crotch, her anus, raping her with their hands. She thought she was going to die. But as the mob dragged her along, they hit a fence, and there were a group of women, of Egyptian women, praying there. And she fell into that group. And the women stood, and they formed a shield around her. And they held her until soldiers fought their way through the crowd and carried her to safety. She was taken to a hospital that night, and then the next morning, she and her producer returned to the US, where she was hospitalized for 4 days. Often, assaults on women reporters go unreported, where they're couched in vague and veiled terms. But Lara decided to break the culture of silence and go public with her assault. She shared her story on 60 Minutes. In fact, Logan's assault prompted journalists worldwide to begin speaking out. The Committee to Protect Journalists interviewed more than 4 dozen women journalists who had experienced varying degrees of sexual violence, from rape by multiple attackers to aggressive groping. What happened to Laura Logan changed their thinking. They said it was very brave of her to talk about it publicly. She gave us all a lot of courage to speak openly and frankly, because before we didn't. Most of the women that were interviewed kept assaults to themselves because of broad cultural stigma and a lack of faith that authorities would act on their complaints. Time and again, journalists also said that professional considerations played an important role in keeping silent. Many were reluctant to disclose an assault to their editors for fear that they would be perceived as vulnerable and that they would be denied future assignments. But things are changing at the organizational level. News organizations have now established risk protocols and safety standards for journals going into the field. One news network has had ongoing animated discussions asking the question, is a woman more vulnerable because rape is a weapon of war? It always comes down to the same answer, he said. It's a voluntary assignment, and we're going to openly discuss all of the risks. We're certainly about mitigating the risks, but in the end, we let our employees make the final decision about putting themselves in harm's way. Several news organizations are now providing a training course for journalists. The courses train people to take preventative steps to lessen the chance of being sexually assaulted. Advocacy organizations such as the Committee for Protection of Journalists have an obligation as well. By documenting sexual abuse, the committee and other press groups not only enable journalists to understand the risks, they can now define the issue as an expression, a threat to free expression, and use them to seek justice in individual cases and pursue systemic reforms. Next is Marie Coleman. Marie Coleman is an American journalist, or was an American journalist, who served as Middle East correspondent for the Sunday Times of London. Marie reported on the effects of war on civilian populations, repeatedly placing herself in harm's way to bring these civilian stories to light. In 1999, when East Timor was fighting for independence from Indonesia, Colvin stationed herself inside a United States compound, along with 1,500 refugees, almost all of them women and children. An Indonesia militia was threatening to blow the building to pieces. Journalists and United Nations staff members alike had abandoned the city. When she told her editor that only she and 2 female Dutch journalists had stayed behind to help the stranded refugees, he asked, "Well, where have all the men gone?" Marie said, "They don't make men like they used to." And that phrase became part of her legend. She continued reporting from the compound by satellite phone to let the world know what was happening. But it paid off. The refugees were evacuated, and 1,000 people lived to see another day. She called her sister to say goodbye, as she thought she was likely to be killed. Later, she explained, "I just couldn't leave. We'd been living with these people for 4 or 5 days, sleeping next to them, getting rice from them." In a way, it was a hard decision because you had to think, I could die here. But equally, I just didn't feel I could live with myself if I left. It was morally wrong, the idea that we would walk out, say goodbye, and all these people knew they were going to be killed. It was not a decision I could have made any other way. 2 years later, covering a conflict in Sri Lanka, Marie Colvin was struck by shrapnel, and she suffered a punctured lung and loss of her left eye. From then on, she wore a black eye patch, as you see in the picture on your screen, and that black patch became her trademark. Marie wrote about her attack in the Sunday Times of London, and at the end of her piece, she said, "What I want most, as soon as I get out of the hospital, is a vodka martini and a cigarette." Marie liked her hooch. Later that week, after Colvin moved to a New York hotel, a room service raider knocked at her door, and he was carrying a tray with a huge bottle of vodka and all the trimmings for a martini. She found out it had been fixed, she said God knows how, by the East Timor people in the compound that she had helped to save. It was after the loss of her eye that she spelled out her reason for covering wars. "My job is to bear witness. I have never been interested in knowing what makeup a plane had just bombed a village, or whether the artillery that fired at it was 120 millimeters or 155 millimeters. Marie wrote about people so that others might understand the truth. She was not interested in politics, strategy, or weaponry. "These are people who have no voice," she said. "I feel I have a moral responsibility towards them, that it would be cowardly to ignore them. If journalists have a chance to save lives, they should do so." When people called her fearless and brave, she said, "Bravery is not being afraid to be afraid." Marie covered conflicts wherever they broke out, in the Balkans and in Chechnya and Zimbabwe, but she was particularly knowledgeable about Arab countries, and she was particularly stricken by what was happening to the people in Syria.
The
the Wire tells the story of Marie Colvin, one of this country's most respected war correspondents.
Oh my God.
She came to die what many say was a deliberate attack on international journalists by the Assad regime.
I want to tell the stories of each person.
In 2012, in the early stages of Syria's civil war, Marie and photojournalist Paul Conroy stayed to cover the siege of Homs by the Assad regime. As civilians and rebels were indiscriminately shelled, the media center housing them and other journalists was, eyewitnesses say, specifically and methodically targeted. Paul Conroy, who survived the attack, spoke to me before the film's screening in London tonight.
We'd just gone into the main room in the media center, and I heard two huge explosions about 100 meters either side. And I was like, phew. And about less than a minute later, two more huge explosions, 50 meters. And at that point, I knew that this was quite precise location, and they were bracketing and walking the shells onto our building. And a minute after that, we took 4 direct hits on the building.
Dozens of Syrians were killed that day, and Marie Colvin, along with a French colleague, both of whom had made a conscious decision to stay in Homs to bear witness to what was happening to trapped civilians, died.
Marie's death was covered on CNN.
Marie Colvin of the United States worked as a foreign correspondent for London's Sunday Times. She and French war photographer Remy Olchle were in the western city of Homs when rockets fired by the government forces hit the house where they and other journalists were staying. CNN's Anderson Cooper spoke with Marie Colvin just hours before she died. Here's how she described the situation in Homs.
This is the worst, Anderson, for many reasons. The last one, I think it's the last time we talked when I was in Misrata. It's partly personal safety, I guess. There's nowhere to run. The Syrian army is holding the perimeter, and there's just far more ordnance being poured into the city, and no way of predicting where it's going to land.
Anderson Cooper joins us live now. And Anderson, listening to that conversation from last night, we were watching here during the program last night and leaning forward to listen to her urgent report because she's so good. It has to be tough to listen to that now, knowing what happened overnight.
Yeah, it's really shocking. I mean, it's her voice, just hearing it again, was always so cool under fire. And even though she had been to so many conflicts and so many front lines, she never lost her humanity and her ability to see with a new way of seeing it, and to bring that humanity to all of us. And I think that's what made her so remarkable. She was such a brave, such a good reporter, but so very human, even in the midst of all this inhumanity.
And I think her experience is important. You mentioned it. She kept her cool. She was always calm. She liked to go where the action was and expose the outrage, if you will. Listen to this part of your conversation where she is talking about the Syrian tactics.
It's a complete and utter lie that they are only going after terrorists. There are rockets, tank shells, anti-aircraft being fired in a parallel line into the city. The Syrian army is simply shelling a city of cold, starving civilians.
Marie Colvin, I know it's impossible to stay safe, but please try. Thank you for talking to us.
Thanks very much, Anderson.
Anderson, two things about that snippet there just jump out at you. One is her direct and straightforward, telling it like it is, reporting, essentially saying what the Syrian government is telling you is a lie. And then at the end there, forgive me, my friend, it has to be an eerie. You did the right thing, stay safe. But then when you listen to that today, it gives you a bit of a chill.
Yeah, I mean, she used the word lie, which a lot of people don't use. And I think a lot of people, certainly in Syria and around the world, appreciate the fact that Marie Colvin was willing to use that word when she saw a lie. And that's what she's seen day after day in Syria. The regime is lying about what is happening there, lying about what they're doing there, the atrocities they're committing there. Yeah, and certainly at the end, I mean, you always sound like an idiot when you're safe here and on stateside and saying to someone in a war zone, stay safe. They can't, and she knows you can't. But, she chose to go even though she knew she wouldn't, there was no place to stay safe. And Homs, unlike so many other places, there's no place you can escape to. They're surrounded, and anybody there can get killed. And
One of the things, John, people keep saying she's fearless. And I don't think that gives her enough credit. I think she, like many people who report from war zones, I think she felt fear, but she never allowed fear to stop her from going. And I think that's what makes her heroic, and that's what made her so brave.
So, okay, we've just heard from four brave women. They have chosen the role of witness to pain, witness to misery, oppression, and witness to the ravages of war in foreign lands. They have chosen to risk their lives, telling it so that we can't look away. They and others like them are the truth tellers of our time. Marie Colvin was killed by Syrian forces in a targeted rocket attack. She was assassinated. Lara Logan was sexually assaulted by a mob in Egypt's Tahrir Square. Lindsay Addario was captured and beaten in Libya. Nonetheless, each of these women dedicated herself to shedding light on the horror of war for the non-combatants, those with nowhere to run. And as Marie Colvin said, giving voice to the voiceless. It's assuredly journalism of the highest order. That's the end of our program.